The UK Supreme Court has finally answered the question, what is a woman? Their answer? It's upset a lot of people, because the UK Supreme Court have not pandered to the woke mob, but have rather continued the return to sanity, which is picking up momentum all over the world. But what does this mean for Australia, given that the UK Supreme Court has now directly contradicted the Australian Federal Court? My name is Topher Field, this is the Topher Project, and I help busy people to keep up with the world as it changes around us. The news broke just before the Easter weekend that the UK Supreme Court has ruled that, for the purposes of the Equality Act of 2010, a woman is a biological woman, i.e., born as a woman. The online reactions are as polarised and as shallow as you would expect. So let's take a moment to give a bit of context to this decision so that we can understand what it does and what it does not mean and do. The United Kingdom isn't exactly united when it comes to issues around transgender people, and the Scottish Government has been making it something of a mission for them to be as progressive as possible when it comes to gender issues such as female representation on public boards, for example, and also when it comes to transgender issues such as transgenders in sports, in hospitals, and in women's only spaces, and indeed in their prisons. The thing is, though, those two things, women's rights and trans rights, aren't always compatible. One notable event which caused public outcry and is an important part of the backdrop for this story was the imprisoning of a female identifying, what's the YouTube safe word? Someone who had committed grape. And they put this female identifying offender into a women's prison. The person called themselves Isla Bryson, previously known as Adam Graham, and they were found guilty on 2 counts of the offence that I can't name on YouTube in 2016 and again in 2019, whilst identifying as a male. But they had been transitioning during the trial, although they were yet to have the all-important operation. Now, Bryson's estranged wife was having none of it and is reported as saying that the transition was, and I quote, "It's a sham. It's a load of nonsense. He is a man, always has been a man, and I don't believe for 1 minute that he's now a woman. It is all an act to try and get him out of going to a male prison," end quote. There was a huge public outcry, and Bryson was quickly moved from that women's prison to a male prison. And this incident brought into sharp focus the looming collision between trans issues and women's rights, a collision which came to a head in this very court case. Because for 20 years, the Scottish Parliament has been trying to have its cake and eat it too, supporting both trans rights and women's rights. But that leads directly to the very thorny question of, well, what is a woman? If you're going to protect women, then you must first decide what one is. And if a man can become a woman just by saying so, and thus end up in a women's prison or in a women's shelter or a women's only dating app or at in-person events, then what exactly is it that you're protecting when you say you're protecting women? This exact question was asked in the Federal Court of Australia recently in a case called Giggle versus Tickle. I promise I'm not making that up. That is the name of the case. You can look it up. And the Federal Court in Australia has decided that a woman is not defined by their biology, but by their identity. Now, that case is being appealed as we speak here in Australia, and this precedent from the UK Supreme Court, whilst having no legal authority here in Australia, is going to loom large over the appeal of Giggle versus Tickle. And no, that is not a sentence that I ever expected to say in my life. But back to the UK. Scotland, in their enthusiasm to be as progressive as possible, passed a thing called the Gender Representation on Public Boards Scotland Act of 2018, aimed at ensuring that 50% of non-executive members on Scottish public boards were women. And it defined women as including transgender people with a gender recognition certificate. Yes, you can get a certificate for that now. And that was that, or so they thought. A group called For Women Scotland challenged this definition, arguing that including trans women in the definition of a woman undermined the objectives of such equality legislation. It undermined the objectives of women's only spaces, including shelters, hospital wards, and the like, and would allow trans people to claim discrimination if they were excluded from these spaces. Now, of course, that is correct, and that was the point, to force biological women to share these spaces, places, and positions. Now, the Scottish Government insisted that this was all well and good, and as it should be, as did Amnesty International and other activist groups that also supported the Scottish government. And initially they won. In 2022, the Court of Session in Edinburgh ruled that the definition of sex was not limited to biological or birth sex, mirroring the sentiment of the Australian Federal Court in Giggle versus Tickle. But as in Australia, that was not the end of the story. Just as with Giggle versus Tickle, this decision in the UK 2022 was appealed, and late last year new hearings took place in the UK Supreme Court, and their decision has just been handed down, and it's a bombshell. Flying in the face of all of the progressive wokeness that we've seen over the last 15 or 20 years, and it is a huge victory for feminists like J.K. Rowling, because the UK Supreme Court has asserted that woman and sex in the Equality Act of 2010 refers to biological womanhood and biological sex, i.e., what you are born as. Now, this means that transgender people, including those with gender recognition certificates, cannot claim to be women for the purposes of any discrimination under the Equality Act of 2010. Ergo, they are not included in things like the 50% quota of women under the Gender Representation on Public Boards Act of 2018. I.e., you cannot have trans rights and women's rights at the same time. Now, again, let me be clear, this decision has absolutely no effect here in Australia, nor should it. The UK legal system is completely separate to ours. But what's interesting here is not the legal links and motivations, it's the political ones. And specifically the fact that, in my opinion, this unanimous decision by the UK Supreme Court is so unexpected, such a sudden reversal of the previous 20 years of legal precedent in the UK, that I don't think it can be taken at face value. I think we need to ask ourselves, what could possibly have caused such a bombshell decision, such a change in direction? And again, this is just my opinion, but I think that the answer is clear. The answer is that even from their ivory towers, the Supreme Court in the UK could see that the tide of culture has turned. And if you want to be a little more conspiratorial, they can see that entrenching wokeness through the Supreme Court in the UK in the age of Trump 2.0 would be disastrous. Now, there's still a lot to play out in the UK. This isn't a Hollywood ending where the good guys win once and for all. Real life doesn't work that way. But this does send a clear signal to the world at a crucial moment in the legal and political history of the world. That sex, according to the UK Supreme Court, is biological, that women's spaces, according to the UK, are for biological women, and that this is not the time to be tripling down on wokeness. Now, thanks to the Giggle versus Tickle appeal that is already underway, we will soon find out whether the Australian court system gets that memo. My name is Topher Field, this is the Topher Project, and I help busy people like yourself to keep up with the world as it changes around us, including, but not limited to, keeping up with the changing definition of what is a woman. I am 100% viewer supported, so head over to goodpeoplebreakbadlaws.com and grab a copy of my books, my merch, my DVDs. You can join my online course called Getting Your Head in the Game, and of course, please like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.